So it's amazing to be here. I always love anything to do with the advanced practitioners. I have a lot of respect for advanced practitioners, and whenever I go to my GP, which is where I tend to see you guys the most, I'm always very keen to see the advanced practitioners. I'm also very glad to be here at the AAPE Conference. I didn't realise it was AAPE. I thought I'm happier already just to be here. And of course, being the laughing OT, I like to laugh. And my professional body is called the RCOT, so I prefer to be called the APOT than the RCOT. But the presentation title is called Thinking Clearly. And really, this is an amuse-bouche, it's an introduction, it's sharing some of my passion into the research of how we think and how our thinking impacts on our practice. I started with the references, which usually come at the end. And the reason why I've started with the references that usually come at the end is that actually it feels to me another example of where sometimes we just do things for habits. And actually, I think starting with the references could be more logical in a way. So I'm going to talk about some of the references that I'm going to be pulling from in this work. I think it gets you excited about what's to come. Some of the references I think are really exciting. I think it gives credibility to what's going to come, so you understand why I've used the references I've used. And I also think it directs you to the resources straight away. And actually, if you get an amuse-bouche of an idea, what you really want is what next? I'm hungry for it, give me more. So the first reference at the top is a document done on inclusive leadership and all the evidence behind inclusive leadership. And it was a really, really, really big review of theory, evidence and practice on leadership and equality, diversity, inclusion in the National Health Service. It's a fantastic piece of work, and I'll be drawing on it today. Bregman is a book, and it's called Humankind, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's no wonder it's at the #1 bestsellers list for a very, very long time. I got the book, I've looked at the research that's included in the book, I've searched through the reference list, I've looked at some of the articles, and actually it's a really sound piece of work, even though it's not an article as such. But it really captures ideas really well and brings them together. And I'm going to be drawing on some of those ideas. He basically packages ideas where you would think one idea was common sense, but it's almost the absolute opposite of that is the real common sense. And he gives you the reasons why. I've got Cooper, Wright and Whitney with Appreciative Inquiry, and that's a reference to so you can use, if you choose to use appreciative inquiry, is a really interesting author who did a fantastic book on change, and I've noticed his work has been used time and time again in addiction work. This book I thought was okay, but it had a couple of nice little gems in there which I'm using with you today. The next one is an article. The one after that is a book which is quite interesting, but again I pulled on a little. The next one is the Heath brothers. The Heath brothers are a writing duo in America who are both lecturers in, I think it's Stanford and Harvard, and they package ideas in a really, really, really accessible way with lots of anecdotes and lots of stories, and they're really inspiring. They're a great read, and I pulled loads of ideas from them. The one I've included here is called Decisive, How to Make Better Decisions in Life and Work. And the beauty of this book particularly is it's really informed by the two other books that I'm mentioning further down, which are basically by Kahneman. Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winner in his work in decision making, and actually quite hard, heavy reads, but actually the decision making has been repackaged, explaining these ideas in a much more readable way. The final reference on the list is another book that I'd like to pull your attention to that I use a lot today, and it's by Matthew Said, and it's called Black Box Thinking: The Surprising Truth About Success. And when I tell you the strapline of what the book is about, you'll probably think, oh my god, that sounds deathly. But honestly, it blew my mind. It was so good. And it's basically a book comparing aviation with healthcare, which I know, I would think this would be the sort of thing that would send me to sleep. But honestly, it was really good. I'm going to be pulling on that today. So there's some of the ideas that I found particularly useful today. But first, I'd like you to have a little think about the presenting situation I'm going to give next. I want to gather your opinion. So, Mr. Schultz is 60, of Sheffield. Apparently, it's very sunny there. I don't believe that for a minute. And he was arrested under the suspicion of embezzlement. He has owned his small advertising business for the past 2 decades, which has grown from himself alone to employing 10 full-time staff. He has a strong reputation in his community for his charity work. Also, he is well liked by his employees for being kind and fair. His wife, 58, has helped him with the accounts since their 2 children left home after studying at university. Unfortunately, the business has been struggling with cash flow for the last 8 months, and whilst there appears to be new business coming in the next few months, a cash injection is needed now. He is accused of taking a substantial amount of money out of the pension funds of his employees. What do you think should happen? So take a couple of moments. What do you think should happen in this scenario? I can't see a chat bar, so I'm going to guess that you've started to give your opinions. Or I'm hoping you've formed some opinions at least. What's really interesting with this scenario is that actually as individuals, we will all interpret this scenario in a different way and we'll all have different thoughts. And the way they call these different thoughts is often referred to as noise and bias. Bias relates to a proportionate weight in favour of or against an idea or thing, commonly considered in a way that is closed-minded, prejudiced, or unfair. Biases are considered to be innate or learned. For example, prison is primarily a punishment and a deterrent, or rehabilitation, or to remove dangerous people from the community, and often that's linked to your political leanings, so that would be considered a bias. An interesting one for us in health is empathy versus rational compassion. And Bloom, who is a psychologist, in 2016 wrote a book called Against Empathy, and called for us to move away from empathy, which is what we've been taught for years and years and years, to put our feet into the other person's shoes, to really think about what it would be in their situation, to empathise to such a degree that we feel into their situation. And what he says, and the researchers kind of found out, is that actually, if we empathise, we can only empathise to a certain degree for each person. And what we tend to do is empathise to people who we feel are more like ourselves. And actually, what that creates is bias. So, because we feel for those people more, we create a bias towards that person, and they tend to get better care. Which obviously, when we're trying to produce healthcare that's fair and equitable, that's not ideal. The other thing that's been shown about empathy is it uses sections of the brain that actually are similar to willpower, in that they fatigue. When you use rational compassion, so you are compassionate, but you don't feel into that person's pain, actually that doesn't wear out your system, you don't have a limited amount of it, it doesn't fatigue you, and actually it enables you to take action. So if you are compassionate towards people, you understand their situation, and you are compelled to help those people, you are more able to do your work. Which I think is really interesting. It's an interesting kind of idea of how bias can actually influence our practice. What we know about noises, or how they describe noise is all the other factors that influence our thinking. And it's one of the ones we look at bias, but we don't look at noise as much. But it's really interesting to be aware of. Noise can include so many different things, huge amounts of factors. Noise can include Botox. Did you know that when you have Botox, it prevents you from frowning, it prevents you from putting on certain facial positions? And actually, we have mirror neurons in our brain that we face a smile, we smile, we face a frown, we frown. And if we're not putting it on externally, we're actually trying it on inside our brain. And that links to our pain matrix. So actually, we don't have to try hard to empathise because we naturally have that inbuilt equipment anyway. So we can easily become compassionate. But what they find with Botox is that if you're unable to mirror the facial features that you're seeing, you're less able to comprehend what the person is trying to display. You're more likely to get their emotion wrong. Other things that impact sunshine. We know that sunshine, if it's too sunny a day, people are likely to get harder sentences. If it's lightly sunny, people are likely to get easier sentences. The mood we're in will massively impact on how we're willing to treat people, the extra lengths we'll go to. They've shown at the end of the day, physicians are more likely to give out opiate-type drugs than at the beginning of the day. People are more likely to refer for physio at times after lunch than at the start of the day. We know that the birthday that somebody has makes an impact on somebody's sentence if they're going up for court. That we know that sporting success makes a difference. There's so many different components that we call noise, which are the everyday things that can impact on our thinking. And what I want you to take away from that really is that actually what we do is complex. We think that we're using professional reasoning, we think we're using professional judgment, but actually what they've shown at different times, we will think in different ways. So there's all sorts of details about Mr. Schultz, from his surname Schultz to his age, to the fact he's from Sheffield, to the fact that he's got a small business that might actually influence your thinking where you don't realise it might be. Kahneman described two types of thinking. The one side is fast thinking and emotional, and thinking involves associating new information with existing patterns of thoughts. So if we recognise a task, we tend to go what we know and we tend to replicate it. The other thing we tend to do, we consider the known knowns more than, it sounds like a poem or some sort, doesn't it? More than the unknown knowns and the unknowns. So what we tend to do is make decisions on what we know. We might know there's information we're unaware of, but what we tend to do is make that decision on what we know rather than searching out that information, or inverting ideas completely on the head and questioning the information we have. We all have a tend to satisfice, and we all have an overconfidence in answering the questions. How many of you actually said in your mind, actually, I think he should be sentenced, actually, I think he should have community leave? We're not judges, we're not trained to be judges. But what we know about human nature is we have a tendency to answer questions where we don't have authority sometimes. The idea of satisficing, obviously is a made-up word by Kahneman, is the idea that when we're given a problem, we will look for the first two or three suitable answers and we will stop and choose the best of those three. So we have a tendency to satisfice. So if I was to ask you to recommend me where to go for a meal tonight, you might say, oh, there's this great place in Canton, and it's just amazing Chinese food. It's really, really delicate flavours. The chef is renowned. And you might say, oh, but there's also this amazing fish restaurant down the bay that does X, Y, Z. What people don't tend to do is ask for the extra information. They don't tend to say, what is your budget? How far are you going to travel? Are you going to be in car? Are you going to be in bus? Are you going to be drinking? Are you taking anyone with you? Do you have preferences to the environment? How long have you got to stay? Are you going anywhere afterwards? Are you going anywhere before? We tend to very, very, very quickly jump on an answer which is satisfying. The other thing we have is that we tend to be influenced by the framing of information. So sometimes we can look at all those extra details. So Mr. Schultz is from Sheffield, and we let those influence us. Another issue that we can have is what we call confirmation bias. So when we think we have the right answer, we will look for proof telling us we indeed do have that right answer. The other thing we can have is what they call cognitive dissonance and tunnelling, whereby we think in a very specific way, which I'm actually going to go onto a slide on. And the other way we can think is slow, deliberately, and logically. I love this TED talk. It's about a guy called Doug Dietz, and he designs MRI scanners. His talk begins with, "This is a tough story for me to tell." And you can actually see he's quite choked as he begins to tell this story. He starts to actually wipe a tear away. And he arrives to what he calls his new baby. He's a proud papa, and he's so excited he's doing his happy dance. He basically comes to see his MRI scanner, and he experiences this life-changing moment of insight when he sees a little girl coming towards the prospect of having a scan, and she's crying because she's scared about the big machine. And he starts to actually question about what he's actually produced, this massive machine that looks like a great big stapler that the child has to venture into. And he starts to ask questions about how they cope with the children. And what he finds out is that 80% of the children are sedated to have their scans. He has a moment of rastrophiliopastrosity, and I know that's a great big grand word, but actually it's quite beautiful. And what it refers to is when you have an idea and you have the action to make it happen, which in my case can be quite rare. I have lots of ideas, but I don't always have the ability to make them happen. And that's why it's important to get your crowd, your team around you to help you. And he begins to redesign and explore with fresh expert opinions on actually how could they do this differently. And he creates these amazing MRI scanners. He has ones where you have to get on top of a log, and the log, you have to stay still, otherwise it won't balance. And when you stay still, the fish jump around your head. He has smells that come off, like things like pina colada for the parents. So the parents are in a good mood, it influences the children in a good mood. And after his work, after he redesigned these scanners, the anaesthetic rate of the children went from 80% down to 0.09%. It's an incredible difference. And the worrying thing was that if he'd have stuck with his cognitive dissonance, basically that means that what we do is sometimes if we believe something, we like to protect our beliefs by justifying them, by reconciling the difference between information, basically explaining away different or avoiding new information. And it's what we know healthcare particularly has an issue with. For example, John Hopkins, and I know this is a slightly older article, in 2013 reported that there are 1,000 preventable deaths and 10,000 preventable serious injuries per day in hospitals. That's 1 in 10 admitted in the UK are killed and injured whilst going into the hospital setting. That's equivalent to 2 jumbo jets falling from the sky every 24 hours. And it's the book I was talking about where he looked about all the different reasons why healthcare are particularly prone to cognitive reasoning, to cognitive dissonance. And we're taught that we're professionals. We're taught that we're correct. We're taught that actually we're in life or death situations. And actually the burden of trying to do the correct job very passionately can actually make us try and protect ourselves from the truth. And the truth is actually we're all fallible. And what we need to get very good at is spotting potential errors in the way the airports and the air flights do. The air flights only have 0.12 accidents per million flights. That's 1 accident per 8.3 million takeoffs. It's a huge difference to actually the accident and care issue rates that we have within hospital environments. And actually, we could take more of an aviation approach with our leaderships, the teams, and the tribes that we create if we have inclusive teams that embrace diversity, embrace a error embracing response, who generate more ideas with more evaluation of them. And remember, leaders can be at any level. Your tribe can be any group. It doesn't have to be just within the workplace. It's about getting groups of people together that want to look at where errors happen in practice and where we want to innovate and change practice. And I've got some features of inclusive leadership on the next slide that I'm not going to particularly go to, and I'm not going to go through psychological safety because I'm hoping you know what these are, and I'm leaving these slides so they are available. I'm pretty sure Anna said you would be able to have them. But actually, if we're in leadership groups where we're encouraged to find our errors without reprimand, that actually this is a good thing, where are our near misses, it means we can innovate before accidents happen. This is another example of a great innovative practice, and it's basically where somebody was, it's called Landermeads, it's a dementia care home, and they were doing a great job. They had clients who were very, very well cared for. Their physical needs were very well met, and they were a traditional task-oriented care home. And basically, they asked a question about 4 years ago in a staff meeting, and they asked whether their clients were well looked after, but were they happy? And actually, they had to come to the agreement that actually they were very well looked after, but actually their clients were very unhappy. And they went and looked at a very, very different model of practice, and they looked at a butterfly model. And they shifted from a task-orientated care home to a feelings-oriented care home. So it was no longer institution, it was considered a family home. And some of the changes they made were about no longer having staff breaks, which sounds completely, imagine not having staff breaks, but actually you don't have a break from your family. Not having separate toilets, not having separate cups, not having a drugs trolley, not having set times for going to toilet, waking up, going to bed, for food. And actually it was all about how the residents felt. And what was really interesting about this care home was not only did the residents get happier, they improved staff retention, the staff felt they were doing better work, and also it appealed to younger staff. And what they found was younger people wanted to come into these environments to work because a lot of the young people didn't have the family sense that they wanted, and actually it became a very healing environment for those younger people as well. But they tore up the rule book and they purely went by feelings, and it was hugely successful. Which kind of begs the question of how do we think differently? How do we challenge our thinking? How do we look for the near misses? The Heath brothers put forward some really nice ways to consider additional alternative ideas, because when people consider additional alternative ideas, they tend to be 6 times better than those who only considered one considered option. What we tend to do when we get a decision to make is we tend to turn it into a whether or not decision. Shall I do this or this? I know when I go shopping, I ask myself, do I want a curry? Not, do I want a curry? Or do I want to get a salad and have a walk and maybe use that money to go to the cinema and I'll feel healthier afterwards? Does that make sense? It's just an example. Curries are obviously very good for you, particularly if you make them healthy. But what we tend to do is a yes or no. And what we can do is open our options up so that we have several options at once. And actually we can follow those different options. They give a great example of a company who put forward I forgot what you call it now, a process for bids to do the work. And instead of choosing one company, they chose 3 companies for a month who basically worked on an app, a health app they were developing. And they basically got the best ideas from all the group. they benefited from working alongside one of the groups the most, and they chose that group to work forward with. But from doing that, they got all the best ideas, they worked out which group they'd work the best, and they saved themselves problems in a long time because they also identified where the glitches would be and the best way forward because they had more opinions. It's a completely different way of working, but actually it worked very well. So what are the ways that you can increase your options of working? Always ask, how can I increase my options? And don't limit yourself to one. It's okay to go back. We tend to choose one, and we don't like to go back to the idea that we've made the wrong decision. Have those follow-up options still available where possible. A good way to do this also is to take away your present options. So if this wasn't an option, what would my other options be? It forces your brain to use your inner crowd, and that's what they call it. They say get another opinion, get an expert opinion. If you can't get lots of expert opinions, what research shows is if you ask yourself questions in different ways, you can force yourself to bring more answers. So one way you can do that is by sleeping on it, leaving a period of time and asking yourself the question again. Another way is to assume you're incorrect. Think about the reasons why you might be incorrect and follow up more information. Think why those reasons might be wrong and might alter your idea, and then present a second idea to yourself. The other thing they say is sometimes if you can't sleep on it, you can generate the idea of thinking in the future. So the rule of 10-10-10. How will I feel about this decision in 10 minutes? How will I feel about this decision in 10 weeks? How will I feel about this decision in 10 months? How will I feel about this decision in 10 years? Sarah Kontansky, an occupational therapist, says that actually we should take away the limitations that stops our imaginations working. So by saying, how is this going to look in 50 years? What if I was going to design this? How could it look in 50 years? We actually take away the barriers so we can do more free thinking. Another way you can look at it is by doing a pre-mortem. I do with this with my students a lot. So they have to design projects and then they come and present them. And before they present for assessment, I say, I'm really sorry if they did a service development. Your service has decided not to be funded. And they have to write down all the reasons why their service wasn't funded or failed, why their service didn't work, and then they have to future-proof all the reasons into their business to protect their business or to protect their idea or protect their intervention plan. I'm terribly sorry your intervention didn't work. Your client has decided that they don't want to work with you. And they have to explore all the different reasons why that might be. Saeed is the person who wrote the Black Box Thinking, the aviation versus healthcare. And he gives lots and lots of different things to think about. He says the single greatest obstacle to progress is failing to learn from mistakes. When we're confronted with evidence that challenges our deeply held beliefs, we are more likely to frame the evidence than we are to alter our beliefs. So the client who gets angry with you, we're more likely to explain that they were having a bad day or they were in pain, rather than actually, I challenged them, I stretched them too far. Actually, I didn't understand what they were trying to communicate for me. Maybe I didn't give the information in the right way. I pushed them into fight or flight. Was that really anger or was that anxiety? We tend to just see the presented information and we don't tend to question it, when really we need to look for errors and we look for near misses. We need to have process and we need to understand care pathways and ways of practice to try and reduce bias. And we need to think about randomized controlled trials, or at the very least, being able to find some way to check that what we're doing is correct. So, for example, bloodletting, it only stopped in the 19th century after 1,400 years of practice. And of course, it was an open loop system closed loop system because it wasn't checked. So if people survived the bloodletting, They said, well, they survived because we let their blood and we saved them. If they didn't survive, they said we didn't take the blood quick enough or we didn't take enough blood. So actually, there was no way of checking. Think about your practice. Do you check in a year's time? Do you check in 3 years' time? How do we check what we're doing is correct? And the other thing he says is that actually we often look for really big changes when actually we can look for marginal gains. So if you think about McLaren, when they improve these super fast cars, what they actually do is try to make minutiae adjustments so they improve the overall performance, because all those small changes add up. So sometimes we need to make big changes and sometimes we need to make small incremental changes. I thought I'd share a little bit of my personal thinking style. Um, I love thinking differently. I challenge everything. I challenge everything I believe, everything I think. And actually, it's led to masses of new research. I think really one of the biggest ways that I helped change my thinking was by having a job in Bristol and living in Barry on the coast in South Wales. It gave me a massive commute. And that commute allowed me to read extensively, allowed me to think extensively, and also at times it was pretty boring. And what I found out about boredom and being alone, it gives you great opportunities to think and to daydream. And what they've shown is that daydreaming lends itself to creativity, and it allows unconscious parts of our brain to process what we're experiencing and asking new questions. And we have aha moments, which are equivalent to learning orgasms in our brain. And I call them learning orgasms. I can come into work so excited because I've learned something new, I've had a new thought, and it's a new opportunity being presented. I tend to learn by thinking about what I've learned, thinking about speaking to other people, getting excited, talking, doing me research, or me search as it's called. So reconstructing my experiences, thinking how they could be thought about differently, chasing excitedly different threads of information and thought, and really sharing and asking what if questions, how questions, who questions, what questions, why questions. And all those tend to come to eureka moments. And some of my biggest bursts of rastrophilia is when I've inverted ideas that I held very, very firmly. And I'm going to go on to not the next slide, but the one after, which are some of the big ideas I asked to bring together my recent research, which is proposing a move from person-centred practice to belonging-centred practice, to challenge the neoliberalism that's impacted on occupational therapists' practice, where they go into clients and we say, we're here to make you independent. And then we're surprised when the clients don't want to use a care package, who don't want to use a piece of equipment, who are disappointed that they might need a care package, who don't say when they're struggling, because actually we've gone in and said we all ought to be independent, when actually we're all interdependent. And see, these are some of the big questions that I asked that led me to this question, from can we learn life lessons from trees? How do we get post-traumatic growth? Why are some cultures thriving and why? What if we did OT wrong? So actually asking big questions is a really exciting place to being sure that when you practice, you're practicing in an innovative and thoughtful way.